Johnny Walker was born September the 10th, 1934. In the early 1940s, he became amateur wrestling in the YMCA, one of the few places where you could actually learn how to amateur wrestle. Before becoming a professional wrestler, Johnny Walker also participated in sumo wrestling, where he was only 191 pounds. He worked out with Azuma Fuji, who was a world champion sumo wrestler in Japan between 1949 and 1953. He also learned weightlifting techniques from Tommy Kono, who was a gold medalist Olympic weightlifter. Johnny Walker has said that sumo wrestling taught him about balance and coordination, and that weightlifting increased his strength in his tendons, which he claims is better than muscle strength. He wrestled in Houston, where Paul Bosch named him Rubber Man, and he spent 15 years as a journeyman wrestler before becoming the masked grappler in Florida, which is his first time wrestling under a mask. Wrestling as the masked grappler, Walker wrestled 52 minutes with NWA World Champion Jack Briscoe before finally taking a fall. Walker struggled as a wrestler and decided that he was really going to walk away from the business. Then suddenly he got a phone call from Leo Garibaldi in Georgia. Mr. Wrestling Tim Woods had left Georgia and they needed a replacement. So they called Johnny Walker to come in and wrestle as Mr. Wrestling number 2. Once donning the mask of Mr. Wrestling number 2, Johnny Walker would never make a public appearance without his mask again. Mr. Wrestling and Mr. Wrestling 2 would become a really popular tag team, winning tag team championships wherever they went during the 1970s, until Tim Woods was injured in the same plane crash that injured Ric Flair in 1978. Johnny Walker would go solo, becoming an even more popular act by himself. In 1977, Johnny Walker, Mr. Wrestling number 2, was invited to Jimmy Carter's presidential inauguration, but he politely declined because the Secret Service wanted him to remove his mask. He would, however, meet with Jimmy Carter's mother, Miss Lillian, several times throughout his career, close friends with them and staying close with the Carters until Miss Lillian's death in 1983. For 30 years in the wrestling business, Mr. Wrestling number 2 retired in 1989, leaving behind an incredible legacy and millions of fans. My education on Mr. Wrestling 2 actually began with me watching Mid-South, which I've said on this channel that I've started watching Mid-South numerous times now. But Mr. Wrestling 2 is a featured performer there, one of the top stars, probably the number 2 babyface in the entire promotion. What I found compelling about Mr. Wrestling number 2 wasn't exactly his wrestling matches, as they were kind of, typical wrestling matches. They were kind of brawling. There's a little bit of brawling, a lot of knee lifts. But what made Mr. Wrestling 2 engaging to me was his vocal style. He was really good at cutting fiery, intense, blunt promos. They got straight to the point. Not too much, trying to be like Dusty, who was trying to be a little bit poetic or bombastic as Ric Flair. It was it was classic tough, fiery, tough guy stuff. And I talk a lot on this channel about fiery baby faces and showing intensity and showing passion. And Mr. Wrestling number 2 is, a great resource for people who want to learn about how to show emotions. Even though he's wearing a mask, you could still tell what his emotions were because he conveyed them so well vocally and through his body language. Though I'm not done watching Mid-South Wrestling, one of my favorite feuds right now is the Mr. Olympia, Mr. Wrestling 2 feud. I started watching Mid-South in 1982, and Mr. Olympia was one of the top baby faces in the promotion, often tag teaming with the Junkyard Dog. He was also the Mississippi Heavyweight Champion for a really long time. And what happened would take place is over the course, like later in 1982, they started doing this storyline with the various masks of Mr. Wrestling number 2 were being defaced. They were stained. One of them had, kind of fake blood on it with like an injury tape wrapped around it. There was like a voodoo doll of Mr. Wrestling 2 hanging from the ropes once. There was a lot of mind games, and you could watch and you could tell this comes with basic storytelling, where you could see Mr. Wrestling 2 was kind of unraveling. He was becoming very angry. He was becoming very frustrated with these individuals who was playing mind games with him, but we didn't know who it was. At first, we were told it was Kamala, and that Kamala was snatching the masks off of opponents who didn't wear masks. So, they would pay Kamala's opponents to wear masks so that Kamala could take them off. So that was kind of a red herring, because later on we find out that the real culprit was Mr. Olympia, who had lost he had taken the place of Mr. Wrestling 2 in a tag team match and had to leave Mid-South Wrestling for 90 days. And the basic story is that Mr. Olympia was the most famous masked wrestler in Mid-South Wrestling, even though the Grappler had showed up and the Masked Assassin, I think, had shown up by this, at some point in 1982, but they weren't as popular as Mr. Olympia. And Mr. Olympia felt like he had been pushed to the side. And it was a really great story. Like it's not over yet because I'm still watching it. I haven't seen like the end of the story yet, but it was really creative how it was done, how it was put together. Because after Mr. Olympia, who took Mr. Wrestling 2's place in a tag team match against I think Ted DiBiase and someone else, I think it was Matt Bourne, but there was the loser leaves Mid South Wrestling for 90 days. Mr. Olympia got pinned, had to leave for 90 days. And then when Mr. Olympia came back, Mr. Wrestling 2, who was by this time super frustrated and angry and bubbling over, he found Mr. Olympia's brief suitcase. And within the suitcase was all of these stuff that had been uh, all of the Mr. Wrestling's masks and things that had been manipulated and stained and destroyed and all that type of stuff. And he accused Mr. Olympia of doing it. And it seemed for a moment that Mr. Wrestling 2 was actually about to turn heel because Mr. Olympia had just returned. He was a hot baby face. And we find out later that Mr. Olympia really was behind all this. So it was really well done. I liked it. I liked the idea behind it. It's an interesting story. I wish that, I wish I could have waited until I saw the end of this story. But there's something to be said about basic storytelling, simple storytelling, and people don't realize it, but what the two of those guys were doing was acting. There was a scene where Mr. Wrestling 2 is accusing Mr. Olympia after a match or something like that, and it begins in the locker room. And Mr. Wrestling 2 has the briefcase, and he's like, "Is this your briefcase? Is this your briefcase?" And Mr. Olympia is like, he's backing down. The scene was far too long, by the way. It was like a really long scene. But ultimately, Mr. Olympia is backing off, like, "No, I'm your friend. I wasn't here. I was gone for 90 days. Why would you think it was me?" And Mr. Wrestling 2 attacked him. So this is before Mr. Olympia is outed as being the reason, being the man behind all this. Well, Skandar Akbar is the man behind all of it, but Mr. Olympia is helping or participating in all of this nonsense. And it looks for a while, people are unsure of how to respond when Mr. Wrestling attacks Mr. Olympia, because Mr. Olympia these are two top baby faces here. And now Mr. Wrestling is attacking Mr. Olympia for seemingly no reason. And of course, it comes out later that Mr. Olympia is working with Skandar Akbar, the evil Arab, the oil billionaire, who is, they're working together. And, we find out that Mr. Olympia is jealous of Mr. Wrestling 2 because Mr. Wrestling 2 stole his thunder, coming to Mid-South Wrestling and becoming the most popular masked wrestler. I almost said grappler because that's a different person, but masked wrestler in the promotion. And it's really good stuff. Like I said, you could look at it and you don't need to study. Like there's no moves to study. Because it's the 1980s, there's very few people are doing a lot of high-flying moves and all that type of stuff. Even though Mr. Wrestling is also quite impressive as a tag team partner, because I'm watching, during this whole time, Mr. Wrestling is also tag teaming with Tiger Conway Jr., whose finishing move is the quote-unquote victory roll, which is just a hurricanrana. But it's 1983, I'm pretty sure they have no idea what to call it, but it's a hurricanrana. So, the idea that Scott Steiner kind of created the Frankensteiner is kind of like, no. Tiger Conway Jr. is doing the Frankensteiner, who is a black man, by the way, is doing a Hurricanrana, or the Frankensteiner, quote unquote, in 1983. So it was pretty badass. But, Mr. Wrestling 2 is a wealth of good wrestling knowledge. If you just want to, this is the only stuff I've ever seen of his. I haven't even watched any of the stuff from Georgia or Mid-Atlantic or anything like that. I've never watched him team with Mr. Wrestling, Tim Woods. I have never seen any of that stuff. So in my wrestling education, I'm learning more about the subtle nuances of basic wrestling as opposed to the over-the-topness of, modern post 1990 WWF, WCW, ECW, where everything's like really in your face. There was a lot of subtleness in past wrestling where sometimes they was over the top with things, but a lot of times when a guy had grit and a guy had emotion, like a Mr. Wrestling 2, you didn't need to do a lot, and it's really impressive. And it sucks that he's passed away now, because now I have to continue watching this stuff knowing that he's no longer around. And it was difficult watching the Junkyard Dog matches, and knowing I did a video on a tribute to the Junkyard Dog. It was difficult for me to watch, that stuff and see how popular he was, and to know that he's not going to be able to, he wasn't able to be around for his own Hall of Fame induction. He was dead by then. And now, to know that Mr. Wrestling 2 is in a similar situation, even though he was in his mid 80s, it's really unfortunate. We all got to die sometimes. But I think that everyone should take a moment to go back and really watch some of this old stuff and learn the lessons a lot of these old wrestlers have to teach us, even if it's indirectly. So, what do you guys think about Mr. Wrestling 2? Let me know in the comment section below. Rest in peace, Mr. Wrestling, and I'll talk to you guys later.